I struggle to name many mining communities at all that are better off for having mining. That's a harsh truth.
Should the families of the president, should the families of senior officials be permitted to be holding financial interests of these companies?
There is no other actor in the system that is looking out for the system as a whole.
For decades, we've tended to think of mining and extractive industries as something that happens somewhere else, something that wasn't relevant to us. It's something that's underground, it's in remote parts of Africa or South America or even Central Asia, but that's simply not true because the minerals that are extracted today, they determine who can build the electric vehicles, who manufactures semiconductors, and who dominates artificial intelligence, not to mention equipping modern militaries and geopolitical power. I'm Dominic Bowen, and I'm host of the International Risk Podcast. And joining me today is Dr. Lisa Sachs. She's the director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment at Columbia University's Climate School. And for years, she's been advising governments, international organizations, and investors on resource governance, sustainable investment, and how countries can transform natural resources into long-term prosperity, not just instability. Lisa, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be with you. And as I've told you, I so appreciate your saying how visible these minerals are in the mining sector, because for those 20 years, as you say, for me, they're everywhere. They're in the computer that we use, our phones, they're listening to your podcast, they're in the houses that we live in, they're in the electricity that we consume every day. But as you've described, most people don't think about all of those things around them in terms of the minerals, where they're produced, and the geopolitics and the economic implications of their production. So that has really consumed me for 2 decades, and it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you about it now.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And I know you travel a lot and you lecture at a lot of universities around the world and you're a lifelong learner. Where are you today? What are you doing?
That's right, because we're in global value chains, actually. And I always believe that we need to really understand things. We need to go and see and talk to those in the countries that are shaping the world that we live in. So I'm on the other side of the planet from my home right now. I'm in Hong Kong. I'm here in Asia for 5 weeks, mainly in Hong Kong at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, having a wonderful time learning about the maritime sector and other aspects of the evolving energy system. And then we'll be spending time in China and in Southeast Asia too while I'm over here.
Energy, critical minerals, and maritime are all such important conversations.
I think that they share, first of all, they are deeply interconnected because we transport the minerals on shipping cargo and to produce energy, consuming energy, and then producing energy for the world all over. So they're deeply interconnected, but they also share the quality that you describe of being deeply international, complex sectors that are shaped and shape the economies that we live in and geopolitics and so on. But for many people who don't study them or who don't see them, they don't think about them so often until, by the way, there's a closure of a strait. And then all of a sudden you see how profoundly we're affected. But in reality, all of these corridors, mineral value chains, the shipping corridors, and energy systems more generally are deeply interconnected. They're very global, they're very complex, and they both shape and are shaped by our world order. So I find them all incredibly important to understand and to try to improve so we can live in more sustainable, peaceful communities and a world community.
Yeah, it's a great objective. And of course, we've all learnt about the Strait of Hormuz, but there's many other really critical points, the Strait of Malacca, the South China Sea, right across the Indo-Pacific region. So there's so many areas I think we all need to learn a little bit more about. And recently I've heard some analysts, in The Economist, on Bloomberg, make some really great predictions and some great analysis around critical and raw materials. But one of the things that I've heard them compare it to is the 21st century's equivalent of oil. But I'm not sure that's actually correct because I think these critical minerals, they underpin not just energy, but also artificial intelligence, also military power, advanced manufacturing and economic sovereignty. Where do you sit on that comparison between raw materials and the equivalent of oil in the 21st century?
I just this week, which is funny timing, wonderful timing, but because you and I have been exchanging for quite some time, and it was coincidence that just this week published a brief reflection on what is basically almost exactly the 20th anniversary of my working in the sector. It is also the 20th anniversary of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, which is a wonderful organization that has been working on natural resource governance for 20 years. And so, as part of their anniversary series, I wrote a reflection. And what's actually remarkable, to your point, is that we're hearing about critical minerals now as if they're new. In a sense, this is a new. They're dominating the media and our discussions and the relevance for our economy. But those of us who've been working in this area for 20 years are saying, "What? These have always been central to our economy, actually." And about at the beginning, before the Sustainable Development Goals were finalized, some colleagues and I wrote a memo that's public to the UN General Assembly saying mining is at the heart of all of the Sustainable Development Goals. The natural resources should be reflected in the Sustainable Development Agenda. So I agree with you completely. They're everywhere. I don't think that this is new. They are part and parcel of our energy, our defense, alas, our technologies, and so on. So they're really spread throughout our economies.
Yeah, they're everywhere, and I don't think we all draw the link between many of these minerals and what they actually mean for us on a day to day basis. A little bit of a side: I've started beekeeping recently, and it's such a wonderful hobby. Once you get into it, you really realize how amazing bees are and what they do for the environment. But I was talking to a professional beekeeper. He has about 1,000 beehives, and the bees produce several hundred or if not thousands of kilograms of wax every year, and he sells it in these big blocks. And I was asking him what he sells it to, assuming his answers were going to be, to candle makers. But he actually mentioned it's to defense companies that are making ammunitions, because of course they're covered in a wax. The end of the munitions are covered in a wax, and you don't necessarily draw the link between these beautiful nature, creatures, bees, and bombs. And I think the same when we go back to high school. It's probably the last time many of us considered lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, graphite, tungsten, and other rare earths. But these are things that are so important today. What are the things that CEOs and business leaders and board members that are listening to the conversation today, Lisa, what do they need to understand about these raw materials?
Yeah, first of all, what you describe is, alas, profoundly true across a lot of sectors in our economy, where the defense sector is what drives so many decisions and is the consumer of so many technologies. We have a lot of technological advances because of the military. Batteries and so on are also advanced in part because of their military applications. I regret that. I don't like their use in the military, and I think that we should be producing materials for the peaceful societies we want to live in and ensure that they're extracted and governed peacefully. But they are indeed important to the military. What's interesting, actually, is even the name critical minerals and critical minerals. That is mainly from the way that we've classified certain minerals that are critical for defense. But actually, many of us in the field refer to critical minerals as those that are critical for clean energy technologies and for the batteries and the component parts of a future clean world that we want to live in. So we're co-opting that name for critical for the world that we want to live in. But I think the basic answer to your question is that they are critical for all sorts of applications in our economy, but that what makes them so profoundly complex, but also important is that not only their end use, but where they're extracted from and how, and who is affected by that extraction, where they're processed, how they're transported, who captures the value, where they're produced, and who gets the final product. That is profoundly unequal, not well governed, and is the source of a lot of conflict, actually, and if done properly, could be the source of great stability and peace. So that's been what I've been working on for 2 decades.
I think that's just so important. And I think as governments, race, and they really are racing, and I definitely see that. The governments are racing to secure critical minerals. And I think there's these other risks that are becoming much more obvious to many people around corruption, political influence, environmental damage, community resistance, supply chain coercion, and definitely, as I said, that competition between major powers. And I think many of our listeners, when they hear resource governments, they might be thinking about environmental regulation and mining permits, which is part of it. But something that I've seen and something that I've experienced around the world, when I visit mines in Sudan, in DRC, in Pakistan, or when I visited oil fields in Syria and even in Iraq, it seems to me, definitely from what I've seen when speaking with a lot of local stakeholders, that governance really determines whether natural resources become a blessing or a curse. So when you're using that term, when you're talking about resource governance, what does it mean in practice? And how do we ensure that a mine in Balochistan in Pakistan or an illegal gold mine in DRC or Sudan, what does resource governance really mean? What should we understand from that term?
You're absolutely right. And the characterization that governance is what shapes whether natural resources lead to sustainable development, that's what brought me to law school. Literally, that was literally my question. Well, this must be a question of governance. But almost immediately when working in the field, I realized governance is critical. But I needed to understand the power and the water and the transport and the communities and how the communities were affected and where did the communities get their health care and what were their jobs in the future. And
Yep.
that is a public investment program. Where was the public sector getting their funding? Could they borrow affordably? What were the role of the development partners? The companies that were operating, they had subsidiaries all over the world that they were paying their profits to, and the tax havens and all of these things. And I realized, oh, this is bigger than governance, actually.
Hmm.
This is this the natural resource sector and how its value is created and divided is really part and parcel of our international financial architecture, of geopolitics, of our environmental considerations. And I think that understanding that holistically is absolutely critical, because otherwise we really risk looking at these challenges myopically, developing or thinking that we understand a problem. And maybe I'll just end by saying that the way we understand risk in a sector, I think, is reflective of that narrow lens, because from any one vantage point, either companies or financial sector understand risk as one sliver of that. They see community unrest and they think, oh, that's a risk. We understand community unrest. Here's how we'll address it. When really the community unrest or the environmental risk or the climate risk or financial risk or technology risk, these are all really interrelated in this complex system. So understanding the complexity is core to understanding and managing the risks as well.
And history, it's full of countries that have been blessed with just absolutely extraordinary natural resources, but they still stay poor. They stay politically unstable. They remain extremely unequal in terms of society. Now, economists have called this the resource curse, which is a nice title and it kind of makes sense. But when trying to explain that to people, and I've had this conversation ad nauseum with my son when coming back from different countries, and it's hard not to give just throwaway or blanket lines. But can you explain to us? You've been working on this for 20 years. I'm sure you've got the answer. Why do some countries transform natural resources into prosperity when some end up trapped? They're trapped by corruption, instability, and generational conflict.
I'm so glad you've asked. And here's my 10-hour lecture on the natural resources. No, you're absolutely right. That what's called that, is it a blessing or is it a curse? It should be a blessing.
Mm.
And I would say the concept of the resource curse itself, by the way, is a relatively narrow concept, actually, and it refers to whether the export of that dependence on natural resources crowds out other productive sectors. But the more general concept, or the more general reality, I would say, is that the blessing of having huge natural resource deposits, which should have translated into value for society. That goal is to translate subsurface natural resources into human capital, physical infrastructure, and well-being. That hasn't happened to the extent that we have expected. So that has been the question. And I have to tell you honestly, and then have my thoughts, but I have to tell you honestly, this 20 years has been a reflection of, oh gosh, we need to take stock of the fact that we've been working on this for 20 years, developing more, by the way. I've been working on it for 20 years, developing increasingly sophisticated tools, frameworks, trainings, thinking, oh, it's a matter of better governance in the contracts. It's a matter of a better fiscal regime. It's a matter of shared use infrastructure. It's a matter of managing community benefits. It's a matter of where the processing is. And thinking that if we can develop a playbook for natural resource governance, surely we should see better societies. And the reality that we really need to grapple with is that 20 years later, we are not seeing the benefits. And actually, many mining communities, I struggle to name many mining communities at all that are better off for having mining. That's a harsh truth. The countries that are blessed with natural resources remain deeply impoverished. And the fact that we're asking the same questions now about critical minerals as they're in the headlines again, well, that's an indictment on what we've accomplished. I think the conclusion I draw from that is that it's not really about the governance of the mine. It's really that, and this is what I wrote this week in this reflection, is that I think the failure has been to treat natural resource governance as a field unto itself and not to recognize its deep entrenchment and interconnection with geopolitics, international finance, poverty in general, and the challenges of public investment, and other aspects of global value chains that shape the ability of states to translate those natural resources. But this is, I would say, 20 years on, we're still learning, and it is ever more important that we learn and that we reflect so that we can do better for the next 20 years.
And when we look at the next 20 years, there's a bigger development agenda, and we call that the energy transition. And, this is often presented as something that's unquestionably positive, but replacing fossil fuels with batteries, with wind turbines, with solar panels still requires enormous quantities of minerals that have to be extracted from somewhere. Are we at risk of solving one global problem and unintentionally creating another, or is it still a very positive story?
I think it's a profound opportunity, and that some of the shifts are very positive shifts. And here's why I say that. So, first of all, you're right that the whole clean energy economy, both the actual clean energy technologies, solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, electric vehicles, other types of transport, but also buildings and other types of networks, they're all mineral intensive. So these are going to play a major role. It makes the challenge and the imperative of extracting them and processing them and using them properly in a way that preserves the sustainability of our planet, but also that allows communities that from where the resources are being extracted to benefit, it makes that challenge even more, or that imperative even more profound. But why I see it as an opportunity is the following: that what has always defined this sector is that the raw materials themselves have not very much value. Where the value is added is in the processing and in the products that are produced. But that processing and the products that are produced it's processed where there's affordable energy and then where the markets are. And that has very rarely been near where the products are, where the raw materials are extracted. So that's been the story of natural resource extraction from the DRC, from Mozambique, from Indonesia, from Latin America, is that the raw material is extracted and exported to the place where they can be processed more with reliable energy and then produced for markets abroad. What's changed now is that the availability of clean energy, of renewable energy affordably in these countries, means that processing them near the mine is increasingly feasible. And the fact that these countries now have the markets for batteries and energy technologies means that the markets are closer. So I would say this is a new opportunity. We have another bite at the apple, so to speak. It's not that it's going to be evidently better. It's that now we have more factors aligned to really think properly. How can we extract the resources, produce them in the regions or process them in the regions from which they're extracted so that more value can be captured, and then actually develop the component parts for a competitive clean energy economy in these regions, sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, that have been poor because they haven't had all of these materials and these opportunities. So that to me is the new opportunity enabled by clean energy technologies and more affordable energy all over the world.
And I think it's very easy for us to throw mud at weak institutions, the Assad regime in Syria and corrupt officials in DRC or in conflict affected parts of Mali. But I don't think these resource governance issues are confined to countries with just weak institutions. We've seen recent reporting in the New York Times, and I think the Washington Post also had some information where it was examining a major tungsten project in Kazakhstan that could receive up to 1.6 billion in US government support. And the issue that this is raised with people is that the companies and the investment vehicles are linked to Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, as well as the sons of the US Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. Now, they appear to be connected to the wider transactions. Now, the families, it's important to note, the families have disputed any suggestions of impropriety, and even the Trump sons have said that they're just passive investors. But I think this case, wherever you sit and how much you weight you place on this, it does raise that larger governance question. Regardless of the country, when a government identifies a mineral project as strategically important, and America does this all around the world, when a government helps negotiate access, which lots of governments do, that's what embassies do, and when they provide substantial public financing, which many countries do to support their national interests in their mining companies, should the families of the president, should the families of senior officials be permitted to be holding financial interests of these companies? So, what does this case tell us about conflicts of interest, about political capture and safeguards that should be needed when we're looking at this sector and geopolitics and how they all collide?
Yeah, Dominic, that's really thoughtful reflections. If unless you've been really studying this sector for so long, but you reminded me, and I was already thinking of one of my most naive, but a moment I look back on with some humor and humility, which was that the WikiLeaks came out when I was in college, finishing college, or actually it was early in grad school, and I was seeing these WikiLeaks from these embassies, notes from the embassies describing I was already interested in extractive sector, and I saw these memos from the embassies describing the pressure that they were putting on the foreign governments on behalf of the U.S. companies. And I thought I had unearthed something. Do you know that these embassies are putting pressure on countries to respect bad contracts? Can you believe that they're doing that? Of course, that is, as you just said, literally what they're there to do, is to defend U.S. interests at all costs. And that is what happens. And that is what shapes so many of the outcomes that we see, the contracts that are formed and the way they're formed. What wasn't in the New York Times, but I read it on Twitter recently, just within the past week, was a outgoing speech from the U.S. ambassador to Zambia that was criticizing the government of Zambia for its corruption and mismanagement, and saying they couldn't get anything done. And a bold and wonderful statement from one of the Zambian officials. I apologize, I don't remember which one, I think from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if I recall correctly, saying, you're not telling the full story. We didn't conclude the health deal that you were offering to us, or you were suggesting we couldn't conclude, because you were tying it to mineral rights. You were making it contingent on having access to mineral rights. He just writes that right out there. So these are, I think, just two stories that show three stories, I guess, if you count mine, that show the tip of the iceberg of the realities of the geopolitics of the natural resource sector. And even when it's not those types of deals, by the way, that level of corruption, the Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers revealed all sorts of structuring for those who haven't read them, they're worth reading. It's really, what's remarkable about them is it's hardly illegal, actually, even to do that level of moving countries' domiciles from one country to another before concluding a mineral deal, because it reduces the tax burden and so on. So a lot of this is legalized corruption, but it's still corruption. And just to say what you rightfully said, we often say, oh, the DRC, they're so corrupt, Zambia, they're so corrupt. Well, that's the narrative that we're told. But this is the geopolitical reality. And those countries have their hands tied in many ways. They are poorer. They can't borrow as easily as the developed countries can. They're in many ways dependent on not just the assistance, but of the framework set by the developed countries. And those are the developed countries saying, give us this mine or else you don't get your health budget. So that is the complexity and the real corruption, I would say, in the sector.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think another area is resource nationalism, which I'd like to explore with you. But I'll just take a moment, Lisa, to remind our listeners that if you prefer to watch your podcasts, the International Risk Podcast is always available on YouTube. So please go to YouTube and search for the International Risk Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe and like our content. It really is important for our long-term success. And Lisa, as you've just spoken about, governments increasingly want not only to extract minerals, but to refine them and to manufacture these higher value products and retain more economic value at home, which is understandable. But I wonder now, as we're seeing more or less globalization, we're seeing more home shoring, near shoring, friend shoring, are these things threats to global markets, or is this just a rational correction as a result of what's been perhaps an unequal value creation that we've seen around the world?
Yeah, again, excellent and very timely question. It's somewhat amusing, not in a hilarious way, but in a maybe frustrating way to see the narratives around resource nationalism. Now, one of my favorite articles, I have to admit, that I wrote with a colleague, or a chapter that I wrote in 2012 or 2013, was looking at that time of claims of resource nationalism. And because we saw it then too, all of these countries were wanting to, and by the way, resource nationalism, as we describe in that article too, is used as a catch-all term, not just to what we kind of the big picture of nationalization of mines, but also of wanting to capture greater benefits, as you describe, or anything that really tries to capture more value from or protect the interests of the country vis-a-vis a foreign investor. It's largely used to capture many of those measures. And back in that time, 14, 15 years ago, when we were doing that research, there were all of these claims of resource nationalism, and the investors were saying, if you try to get more value, we'll leave, and nobody will invest in you again. Those were the claims, and we document them. And then we looked at the Fraser Institute index of investor attractiveness and saw, well, what happened over time when there were those claims of resource nationalism? And the short summary is that these countries, as long as their reforms were reasonable, as you said, because often these are reasonable. They're trying to capture value from their resource and not watch all of the value exported to overseas markets. So as long as they're reasonable, the investment didn't leave. And in fact, of course, that still pans out. We are still trying to get we're trying to find resources all over the world. So that is just to appreciate your thoughtfulness on the use of the term and what it actually means. Is it reasonable for countries to want to capture value from their resources if you're a developing country? Yeah, that's very reasonable. Is it as reasonable for developed countries like the US and Europe, to be clamoring like crazy to make sure that they have their own secure value chains for critical minerals? Well, that I think is self-defeating, actually, because we are leading to a insane zero-sum fight over resources, when what would be absolutely the right thing, as it so often is on this planet, is to learn to live together on our planet. And how can we assure that we all have the materials that we need for our clean energy systems, for our industries, and so on? And by the way, if we could live peacefully, we don't need as many materials for our militaries, because we'd be learning to live peacefully. So I think the obsession over nearshoring or over capturing one's own value chain, that is not as rational as wanting to capture the value for resource rich countries. Rational, maybe, in the sense that you can understand the mindset, but not smart, actually, and won't be successful, because it's going to lead to a lot of fighting, a lot of corruption, a lot of bad deals. There's not a happy ending to that type of scrambling.
And I think there's many business leaders that have just a fantastic insight and really do their due diligence on everything from social issues, development issues, government issues, geopolitics, when they're looking at new markets. But that's certainly not the case across the board. And I think there's a lot of business leaders that are still underestimating how quickly political risks can emerge. One day it's an operational issue, but the next it's something that has to be escalated to the board, and it becomes a reputational issue. And recently I was working with a consortium of companies that were investing in a mine in a conflict or a disputed part of the world, and the risks were severe. And it wasn't just security risks. There was insurgency risks, there was terrorism, there was communities, there was water issues, there was very significant environmental issues, and they really came together. But at the same time, there was a lot of geopolitical, like there was other nation states pressuring this consortium to go ahead with this deal. What are some of the indicators, when you're advising companies, what are some of the indicators that you're advising them to look at? Because there's social instability, there's political instability, there's corruption. What are the things that really rate at the top of your list when you're working with companies and advising them?
Again, excellent questions and observations. One thing that I am increasingly observing, I shouldn't say struck by, because I shouldn't find it surprising, but I do find it notable repeatedly, even this far into my career, is that there's no other actor in the system that is looking out for the system as a whole. We're just not designed to do that. every actor, companies, everyone is optimizing for their own, optimizing within their spheres, which again is rational, but it is in the end damaging because and self-defeating often also because you can when you only look within your sphere, you miss the broader effects. That's not to say, though, that it's easy for companies to look out for the world because they have shareholders, they have political pressures too. So it's not an easy context. But the reality for all of us as citizens to recognize is that when we have entities that are optimizing within their sphere, that is what creates the profound risks and instability that we face because the water, the peace, the value, all of this is optimized when we think about it as a whole. We are on one planet. And so being aware that there's no one else looking out for that, I think helps us understand the challenges we face. When we work with companies, first of all, just to say I don't advise companies from a business interest. We do work with mining companies all the time. And in fact, Vale, the Brazilian mining company, was the first partner of the center from 19 years ago. We used to be called the Vale Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment because of a founding grant. So we've worked a lot with the mining companies. Our engagement with the mining companies has been thinking about how risks can be managed by doing better in those contexts. So not managing risks by bringing in, for instance, if there's social instability, it's because they're not benefiting from or they object to the mine because the costs are greater than the benefits. It's not that that's an easy problem to solve, but it is not solved by bringing in armed military. At the very least, understand what is the context? What are the challenges in the local community? How can you understand the development challenges? How can you think about how one can do better in those cases? That has been my whole career, is thinking with companies about how can you think about, if you are developing power for your mine, how can you develop that power in a way that expands power access and affordability to the region? How can you think about the development challenges in the region and how your mine can contribute? And maybe one last example is what not to do, I would say. I also wrote, I haven't been involved in this case, but I saw I thought, incredibly biased reporting of a mining project in Panama by First Quantum, where there was social conflict. And the mining companies' quotes in the Financial Times at that time were incredibly naive. They were saying to the communities, how do you not understand that the materials under your soil are important for our Apple Watches and our iPads? Oh, how silly and how dumb. But by the way, the result of the community opposition had been that the mining company was bringing a huge lawsuit against the government for not pushing this project through over community opposition, because that's the power dynamic. When the community opposes the mine, the company can sue in an international dispute settlement mechanism that I've also spent 20 years studying. So I wrote publicly that this was really misrepresenting the dynamics and not the way to solve the problem. The communities are right. What is the value that they're getting? They're not getting the iPads and the Apple Watches. So to sue the government because of this sense that the communities are wrong is not the way to solve conflict. And I would say it's why we're seeing the same patterns of community conflict. Why don't they like our social programs? We built them a soccer field. We built them a hospital. Why we're doing so well? That's been the story for 20 years. And that's why I think it's important for everyone, for the mining companies and for the rest of us that vote, that engage, that all of these things, to understand the complexity of why communities that are removed from the capital, that don't have access to energy, that have cultural heritage, why might they not want a mine where the value of that mine is being accrued to the capital, that's being exported to produce Apple Watches for northern markets? Let's think about how we can properly deal with that so that we can get the materials that we want. I also want those technologies, but ensure that the value stays with those who are most affected by the mining.
Yeah, yeah, very, very valid. And we see so much optimism around electrification, around the clean energy transition. And, obviously AI is a little bit more mixed, but there's still a lot of optimism around artificial intelligence and what that can do for us and how we can better use minerals and the resources that we have and improve our supply chains. But Lisa, when you look around the world and when you travel around the world, what are the international risks that concern you the most?
Oh my gosh, a lot of this that consume me. You know what concerns me most is there's so many risks, and I will answer your question, but what most concerns me is how illogical we are in addressing them, because we actually have the capabilities and the know-how and the technologies to do better than we do. That's what concerns me even more than the risks, is that we're not actually so thoughtful about how we solve these risks. I taught in my eighth grade daughter's science class on climate change, and was telling them about new ways to think about these things that when I talk to adults, they don't really understand. And the eighth graders got it instantly. Of course, you can think about different ways of producing energy and whatever. And I realized, oh gosh, yeah, the kids get it at this age. Let's hope that they can inherit this world, because it's the adults that don't. So I really, I do worry about the risks of growing. Well, first of all, climate risk, I think, is very serious. It's here now. Everywhere I travel, we're feeling it every day. The typhoons right now in China to the north,
Mhm.
profoundly. Everywhere you go, you feel the changing climate. And that is happening within your and my, not even lifetime, but within the past decade. And that's crazy, because these are going to continue to intensify. And these are not risks that we can easily adapt to. Again, to my greater frustration, we know how to decarbonize the global economy. We know the pathways. We have the technology. We have the capital. But our approaches to it are so wrong-headed, which has been a big part of my work, that to me is the bigger risk. Are we really going to overlook and get this so wrong for whatever reasons of confusion or whatever it is, because we could address this? So I would say that's one. And then with respect to the AI and to mining and the inequality, that has been one of my motivations for my whole career. We have so many resources on this planet and so much technology. How do we accept that we have hundreds of millions of people that don't have access to energy? How do we accept that? Or I read that book, Everything is Tuberculosis, where we now can basically prevent and treat tuberculosis, but not for hundreds of people that die because they live in developing countries. Why do we tolerate that? I think there's a risk that AI will exacerbate that, when it could
Okay.
ameliorate that, because the ability to access new information, to get better information quickly and to process it, of course, could be mobilized for such good.
Mhm.
And bringing the energy systems and technologies to the parts of the world that don't even have technology, that could help them leapfrog. But are we going to ensure that that's the case? Or are we going to let the benefits accrue to the trillionaires, which is what seems to be happening? So I think the risks are of inequality, of AI, of climate. But to me, the biggest risk, is that we're not awake to the solutions, which are eminently, which are right in front of us. That is the bigger risk.
I think that's fantastic. And I often say risk and opportunity are just two sides of the same coin. And I think you're totally right. That is a huge risk that we don't realize the huge opportunities we have right now. They're fantastic and I get so excited. But there is still a risk that we just overlook them and leave those on the table unutilized. But Lisa, thanks for explaining that. And thank you very much for coming on the International Risk podcast today.
Can I just why I think you're a part of the solution, actually? And I was telling you before that I'm an avid listener of podcasts. That's actually really how I get my information, because I think that the way to overcome that risk of how we think about these things is to try to understand new things, always, to understand the limits of what we understand substantively, to try to learn new things, to think about different perspectives, not to accept conventional narratives, which is, I don't even read the mainstream news anymore, because why bother? I know those are narratives. I know they're just either intentional or unintentional slivers. So I listen to podcasts to hear from people who have been thoughtfully thinking about things. Oh, that's an interesting way to put it. Oh, that's different from what I heard. Oh, and so thank you for what you're doing and bringing these perspectives from so many different experts and substantive areas so that we can think differently about the world and have a shared conviction, I hope, that we can do better by understanding these risks. Again, help us think about how we can collectively, as capable and even more empowered citizens, create the world that we want. So I'm grateful to you for the work that you're doing to help bring us together.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lisa. And that's actually why we created the International Risk podcast. I'm a management consultant. My average week is about 60 to 80 hours worth of work, and I'm always looking for ways to reduce things from my schedule. And occasionally, I'll think about the podcast, and it's like, no, there is no way we're gonna the podcast we keep doing because it's just so amazing. I don't agree with every guest we have on the podcast. I definitely don't know all the topics that we discuss on the International Risk podcast, but having these conversations with people is so incredibly valuable. And I think that's what our listeners like, and it certainly helps me, and I'm sure it helps some of our listeners. So
Especially if you don't agree, that's even more the reason when to listen and to engage. So you're doing
exactly.
the right thing and it's benefiting all of us. So thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to join you.
Thanks, Lisa. Well, that was a great conversation with Dr. Lisa Sachs. She's the director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment at Columbia University's Climate School. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening today. We'll speak again soon.